Hey, what up ladies and gents, it's your favorite Asian robot and hopefully your favorite Diablo 4 content creator. Okay, what I'm gonna talk about in this video is basically why the sorcerer has a fundamental problem that buffs and nerfs cannot solve. What I mean is that the sorcerer, literally no matter what build you choose, has to use an ice skill of some kind. More or less this is Frost Nova because that is the only way to inflict vulnerable. Why is vulnerable so important? If you guys watched my damage video or the video on how damage works in Diablo 4, each damage bucket acts as a multiplier, and this multiplier is crucial to reach the best possible damage that you can do in the game. I have a spreadsheet that I'll show you guys to give a understanding of this in numerical terms, so you can actually see the math as we go through. But before we go into that, if we take a look at the sorcerer's skills, you'll see that the concentration of vulnerable damage is solely focused around ice. Okay, so fundamental problem one, if we take a look at skills, only ice-based skills can inflict vulnerable. Shock-based skills do not do so. If you check the entire skill tree, alright, none of the shock skills, none of the fire skills inflict vulnerable. The most reliable way of inflicting vulnerable status effect on the enemy is via Frost Nova. Ice Shards can guarantee vulnerable. Your Frozen Orb has a potential to make enemies vulnerable. Ice Blades as well can make enemies vulnerable, although it's a percentage-based chance. So when you look at this, you realize that ice, by its very nature, fundamentally was designed with the idea of making enemies vulnerable. And that, thanks to the multiplier effect, which I'm going to show you guys shortly, is why ice is so much stronger than all the other elements, and it is why ice cannot be excluded from a build. You are literally forced to put Frost Nova in every build no matter what element you want to go to, because you have no other choice. You have no other way of inflicting the vulnerable status on the enemy. If we look at the Paragon path, just to confirm this for you guys, alright, let me swap my camera around to the other side, because we're gonna do the spreadsheet, so it's better for me to be on this side. But if you take a look at all the glyphs, alright, you will find the exploit glyph. Where is it? There. The exploit glyph does not, unlike with some of the other classes in the game, it does not inflict the vulnerable status effect. It just enhances the vulnerable status effect. Which means that for the sorcerer, you literally have no choice but to go with Frost Nova or use some other ice skill to inflict the vulnerable status effect on your enemies. Makes sense so far, right? What this means is that every build is literally forced to take Frost Nova, no matter what element you want to play. You want to play a lightning build, you still have to take Frost Nova for vulnerable. You want to play a fire-based build, you still have to take Frost Nova. You want to play a conjuration build, the one that the guy was like, oh, I beat level 100 nightmare dungeons at level 75 with my conjuration builds. Great build, cheesy playstyle. I don't like it myself because I don't really view that as real gaming, but that's just my opinion. It did do what it says it does. By the way, FYI, it does actually do what it says it does. But even that build still relies on Frost Nova. In fact, Frost Nova becomes one of your enchantments so that when you create a conjuration, it has a chance to cast Frost Nova. Alright? So, yeah, you're kind of dependent. Everything that the sorcerer does is kind of dependent on this one little skill we call Frost Nova because it guarantees the infliction of the vulnerable status effect. How important is this in terms of numbers? Let's take a look at the spreadsheet. Ba-ba-bum. Okay, now, taking a look at this spreadsheet right here. Okay, this is a dummy spreadsheet, but I just want to show you. If we were to take 2,500 base damage, right? The first damage bucket is your main attribute, which in this case is intelligence. Okay, when you multiply 2,500 by a 38% damage increase, you get this. All right. Then if you multiply by the core skill damage, you get this, 5,175. If you then have a crit, which has usually a very high multiplier, you go from 5,000 to 14,490. Then let's say we've got another multiplier like damage versus. So damage versus, like damage versus crowd control, damage versus burning. This is a separate bucket on its own. you go from 14,000 to 26,000. Yeah? Then you add on the vulnerable damage multiplier, all right? Which in this case, let's say it's been buffed up to about 60%. You go from 26,000 to 41,000. Of course, there are multiple other buckets that do get included, like various ways that you can boost your damage. I'll show a lot of this later on. But take a look at the difference between this 26,000 and 41,000. That is a difference, okay? If we were to take 41,000 minus 26,000, that is a difference of 15,000 damage. If you were to exclude this damage bucket, all right, a 2,500, like let's say your original hit is 2,500, your damage, if assuming that you don't have vulnerable inflicted on the target, that's the difference between dealing 26,000 damage and 41,000 damage. 15,000 difference. 15,000, if we were to divide it by 26,000, is literally, okay, you are effectively dealing only 60% of the damage that you would have normally done. Okay, that's how much less damage you're doing. You would have dealt, the difference alone is 60% of the original amount. Okay? I hope that impresses upon you the large size of this difference. So missing out on Frost Nova is not really a choice here. You cannot choose a build that does not inflict the vulnerable status effect. You need to have it because an extra damage bucket is a massive multiplier to your damage. Same thing, why fire builds are not as good. In case you didn't know, damage over time cannot crit. You would be missing a multiplier. Let's work through this. Let's work through a quick example just to show you how the same example would work, but this time it's damage over time. Damage over time can be boosted by vulnerable, but it cannot crit. So what happens if you lose your crit multiplier? First, we multiply this, okay, by that, and we add the original amount, okay? Oh, sorry, my formula is bad. There we are. Okay, so in the first situation, okay, the number is the same as it was before because the main attribute applies to everything. This makes sense. We then take this multiplied by this. Okay. I like to have my formulas in perfect order, so bear with me. Okay. And now, lo and behold, it's the same again. Why? Because the core skill damage applies to everything, right? Now, we're going to skip over the crit damage multiplier. So now this is where you start to see a difference. You take this amount multiplied by the damage versus burning. Okay, multiplier. And if we are missing crits, then previously, where we would have ended up at 14,490, and then of course subsequently 26,000, we are now ending up only at 9,315. Okay. This then is multiplied further by the next bucket, and then we add the previous again. Okay, let's put it in brackets so that we have our formula just perfect. And your final damage, pathetically enough, your final damage is a very, very sad amount of 14,904. Okay? This is with the vulnerable status inflicted. Again, this is why damage over time, which cannot crit and is therefore forced to miss out on a multiplier bucket, can never equal direct damage. So the only way that damage over time can compete, all right, is under very specific circumstances where you have a lot of damage over time. For example, the Shadow Necros can compete thanks to the fact that Corpse Explosion has no cost, no cooldown, yet it can benefit from a variety of other skills, and it is damage over time. But that is a completely separate matter. All right, that is a specialized case. Most of the other classes rely on some form of primary resource. They rely on something, or rather, to deal damage over time. So you don't really have unlimited casts. Either that, or it's locked behind a cooldown. And what that results in is the fact that you can't really multiply that damage big time. Furthermore, Necros have a key passive that helps them with this by dealing direct damage. As far as I can tell, let's just use the example of a Sorcerer. I don't believe the Sorcerer has a key passive that deals direct damage. In fact, it's just they just have an enhancer to the burning effect. All right. So they don't have a Shadow Blight key passive like the Necro has. So this again creates a very different issue. Not only are you missing out on a bucket already by default, but just by choosing damage over time, you're missing out on a bucket. You're gonna also miss out on a whole bunch of other passives owing to the fact that you simply don't have something to deal direct damage with. You see? This is why damage over time can work for a Shadow Necro, not exactly as good for a Fire Sorcerer. Which is why Fire Sorcerers end up relying on their Hydra and going more or less for a Conjuration type build, which generally ends up as an all elements build anyway, because you just don't have the same options. This is the fundamental problem with the Sorcerer, that no matter how many buffs and nerfs they give the Sorcerer, it's not going to change this fundamental issue. Ice will always reign at the top. Why? Because Ice can trigger every single multiplier. Crits, as well as vulnerables. And Ice is in fact the element that inflicts vulnerables the most. Ice can still take advantage of damage versus burning targets very easily. Why? Because the Firebolt enchantment just makes you deal burning damage to everything. You don't care about the damage being dealt. It's the fact that it acts as a multiplier. Now, let's take a look at some of the passives. Ice passives are unique in that they are all multipliers based on status effects that you can inflict. Chilled enemies take increased damage. Frozen enemies take double that. All right, you deal extra multiplicative cold damage to vulnerable enemies. That's another multiplier right there. Okay, and frost skills deal extra damage to elites. Okay, that's another multiplier right there. Let's take a look at the passives for lightning and fire. Of course, fire increases mana regeneration, so it's not a multiplier. You deal increased burning damage to enemies for each second that they remain burning. Damage over time as well. Okay, up to 5% multiplier, yes, but after 5 seconds. But this really doesn't help, okay? Then it's after standing still, your pyromancy skills cost 5% less mana, okay? And then a heal. So Frost here has 3 multipliers. Fire does not. What about lightning? Shock skills have an increased critical strike chance and they reset upon getting a critical strike. Okay? Then you've got electrocution. Enemies deal 5% less damage. This is defensive. Then you've got shock skills, increased movement speed. This is not damage based, right? Convulsions. Shock skills have up to 3% chance to stun enemies, and it's a lucky hit. Let's take a look at some of the other passives here. Critical strikes with shock skills can form crackling energy. It's not a multiplier. Every time you stun an enemy, you deal lightning damage to them. This is a flat damage being dealt every time you shock the enemy. Okay, so it's not a multiplier, but it does give you another bit of flat damage that can be multiplied forward because it's direct damage, right? But it's still not as useful as having more multipliers because you've seen the effect of multipliers, right? Okay, pyromancy now, pyromancy does have a good multiplier in terms of critical strike damage, but this can be applied to any build thanks to the Firebolt enchantment. So I don't even count this as unique to the fire element because it can be applied to everything. All right. And for ice doesn't really have any multipliers. So if you're wondering why my build is slightly different from the previous level 70 build, it's because this build that I'm showing, that I have here, is an overclocked build. I'll show you guys how to overclock your sorcerer in a separate video much later toward endgame. This is mostly for pushing high in nightmare dungeons, okay? But basically, there's none of these skills here that are multipliers, therefore they can be just freely switched in and out as needed. Do you kind of see where I'm going with this? There are other multipliers like glass cannon, elemental dominance, all this kind of stuff, but these are general multipliers that apply across the board. Frost, by its very nature, has multiple additional multipliers. Now, just as an example, I'm sure they don't work exactly like this, but just, you know, to explain the power of these multipliers, let's bring up the spreadsheet again. If we were to come here, right, let's take the figure of this vulnerable damage multiplier, okay? Previously, we had a separate multiplier of, say, 12% damage. What's going to happen if I multiply this, okay, all right, by, say, 12%? Let's put 12% in this formula, okay? And then this is the power of having a multiplier. I get an extra 5,000 damage just from that one multiplier alone. Let's add another multiplier on. Let's say it's another 15% because it's an elite, right? So in just two multiplier steps, in just two multipliers, I've gone from 41,000 damage all the way up to 53,000 damage. That is now granted, this would have to be against an elite target, but the difference is an additional 12,000 damage, and we're playing with very small figures here of 2,500 on your base hit. Your base hit actually goes way beyond this. If we were to multiply the base hit by double, say the base damage is 5,000, then we've gone from 83,000, now you're hitting for 93,000, then 107,000, and then the final difference is at 24,000. The gap grows wider. Do you see that? The gap grows wider because the more multipliers you have in a build, the wider the gap grows and the more you can put out. This is why ice builds are very difficult to beat. And this is the fundamental problem with the sorcerer. Other builds are not as viable, not just because they don't have a multiplier effect by losing out on a damage bucket, all right? Because Frost Nova is a thing, you can still put that damage bucket back in. But fire loses out on critical strike chance, all right? Loses out on the critical damage multiplier, which is one of the largest multipliers. FYI, it's one of the necessary glyphs that is pretty much used across all of the good builds because increasing crit damage is a thing, all right? Two of the glyphs that are practically in every build are exploit and your glyph and the glyph for whatever character that increases critical strike damage, because these two are huge multipliers. Okay, so losing out on that puts fire at the biggest disadvantage that I've seen. Unless fire's damage is so excessively buffed to the point that it can overcome that, I just don't see it being competitive outside of a conjuration-based build. Ice is still going to reign as the champion. Lightning can come close because Lightning can have access to all the buckets, but fundamentally speaking, in terms of passives, they have less base multipliers, okay, than Ice would have. All right, even if it wasn't exactly like this, there's still going to be some gap, even if it was additive, hence presenting another problem. The sorcerer is just fundamentally geared toward Ice, and the effect of the multipliers can be felt when you play Ice versus Lightning. Try a Lightning build. You will do okay, but you will still not reach the same heights that an Ice Sorcerer would reach. And that's the problem. That's plain and simply the problem. Also, with several other builds, one last factor, mana regeneration. With Ice, I have two very powerful effects. Avalanche, which gives you a multiplier, again, 40% increased damage as well as a 0 mana cost, because your frost skills have a 10% chance to make the next cast of Ice Shards, Frozen Orb, or Blizzard, which are your main core damage dealers, right? Consume no mana and deal 40% increased damage, and the chance is doubled against vulnerable enemies, which is a status effect you can inflict freely. So, lucky hits are very easy to trigger, and on top of that, this effect is very easy to trigger. You can literally make this effect trigger twice, thanks to the Frozen Memories aspect, okay? So that is another huge multiplier there, and it allows spamming of skills. Being able to cast your skill one more time for free with increased damage is a huge advantage, all right? Unique to Frost. Furthermore, you have Frigid Breeze, Cold damage against vulnerable enemies has a 20% chance to generate 15 mana. All the enemy has to be is vulnerable, and you can inflict vulnerable anytime, anywhere. So what's happening here? You have basically unlimited mana spam, which allows you to trigger so much more casts of your skills for free, and on top of that, you get multiplied damage even further. None of the other key passives do this. Okay? They do, like, Essu's Ferocity triggering the critical strike damage, you know, is fantastic. Is fantastic. I absolutely love Essu's Ferocity because it is a great helper for fire skills. But again, you're pigeonholed into using Hydra or skills that don't deal any damage over time, because then you'd be losing out on critical strikes. Okay? Your shock skills do have a multiplier, but nothing to zero-rise the mana cost. And coming back to the whole point again, they are losing out on all these passives, whereas Ice, the mana regeneration is built in. Did you know that I have to waste an aspect slot? If I were to go with a Chain Lightning build, I'd have to get the Chain Lightning aspect that returns mana on each bounce, which means I'm consuming one aspect slot for that. Something which doesn't increase damage. Excuse me. This doesn't happen with Ice, because the only one where I would not have like, even the one which is considered like just an increase to the passive avalanche, right, still acts as a multiplier effect, because I'm getting one extra cast of a 40% multiplier. That if I don't have to focus any of my stats on, like, any of my aspects on mana regeneration, I can chuck in control aspect, I can chuck in elementalist aspect, I can go with conceited aspect, I've got my ice shards piercing, you know, I've got edge masters. There are so many other ways that I can improve my damage for free. Other elements are disadvantaged because they don't have the same thing. You see? So all of this contributes to the problem of why the Ice Sorcerer is so much stronger than the other sorcerers. This is the fundamental issue that I don't believe that Blizzard can solve no matter how many nerfs and buffs they give, because simply speaking, the passives of Ice are just so much better than the passives of the other class. You see? This is where we have a problem. Now, I would personally like to see more build variety in the game. Build variety is never a bad thing. But unless they can somehow fundamentally change the sorcerer or add something for these other classes to gain multipliers via their aspects, honest to God, I am not seeing a lot of power for these other builds. Arc Lash, Chain Lightning, and all the other lightning builds are still viable end game. Don't think they're not. They're absolutely viable for tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons, and they're still playable in tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons. Okay, I'm sure that there are videos out there that already showcase this. I myself haven't. But when it comes to the whole idea of leveling easy, you know, having a fun time leveling and not sweating hard for your kills, Frost is just so much better than any other element. And unfortunately, that is a case that is going to stay the same forever because it's fundamentally better. Okay, so I hope that this helps to explain the fundamental issue of why the Sorcerer has less build variety that literally buffs and nerfs cannot solve. Okay? The Ice element just has more advantages than every other element out there, and that's a fact. That will never change no matter how much people want it to change. Okay? Thank you for watching this video. I hope it helps to explain, you know, some good info about the Sorcerer that maybe people have not been aware, because a lot of people have been trying to claim that there are a huge variety of ways to play, and I agree that there are. And indeed, a lot of these varieties, like a lot of these play varieties, are great, but when you're truly seeking that optimal experience, it's hard to get that when you know that there are so many more advantages for Ice as opposed to literally everything else. Okay? All right. So now that we've come to the end of the video, it's time for me to thank the supporters that make this stuff possible. Thank you to the following people. These are my August Big Wig supporters. Top Tipper, Big Chungus. Okay, Top Tipper list, Jason Leaving, Mo Rizzle. Top Super Chatter list, Big Chungus and Ender are tied for the top spot. Top Super Chatters are Marcus Carrillo, Juan San, Mike Cawthorn, Daryl Neo, Raised Reality, Mo Rizzle. I'm not that guy. Thank you guys so much. Top channel membership gifter goes to Big Chungus at 50 gifted memberships. Our highest channel membership gifters, Mike Cawthorn, Newbie S92, and Boog Slugus. Alright, our cosmetic sponsors are Sinner, Nightshade, Newbie, and Big Chungus once again. Thank you guys so much. And last but not least, here are our channel members that have supported this channel and made it very, very possible for me to keep doing exactly what I'm doing. Starting right at the top, we have Big Chungus at the Only Fan level. We've got Death Dawn 982 at Plus Ultra, Jerry Fast, OG, Rogue Assassin, Zach MG at Prestige. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to our honored robots as well. Juan San, Corey Ryu, Marcel, Kaishiwa, Bob John, Maxim Lotz, Devin Lashin, Mookie Mocha, Rena, Chase Taylor, Nathan Strong, Nightshade, Lady Neo 2, Joey Danze, Che D12, I'm Peep, Sayed Assad, Coda CMF, Kami SMH, Conrad C, Nate the Great, and Benjamin Savage. Thank you guys, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed my content. I hope this sheds light on why the Sorcerer has a bit of a fundamental issue. Yeah? I'll catch you on the next video, alright? Bye-bye.